A family trapped in a brutal Alaskan storm, a massive grizzly bear lurking outside. But what happens next is something no one could have predicted. When Marcus Bennett saw enormous bear tracks leading to an abandoned photo booth in the middle of a raging snowstorm, he never expected to uncover a chilling mystery. Inside, a family lay frozen, on the brink of death. But what truly shocked him was the massive grizzly that had settled outside, not as a predator, but as something else entirely. Was this beast a guardian or a looming executioner? Stay with us as we unravel this incredible tale of survival, instinct, and a mystery that defies nature itself. The exterior scene was depicted in endless as ruthless as another winter storm. White raged throughout Alaska. Wilderness far from populated areas, Marcus Bennett was standing in front of his lodge. Frost-covered glass, observing intently snowflakes descend in a spiral pattern from the 20 years of operating the darkening Sky Frontier Lodge, had already instructed him to read all of nature's warnings. The air fell off during this storm. Too still, too much snow, and the typical sounds of the forest had descended into a strange quiet in his weather-beaten. A steamy mug of coffee was in the hands. His gaze strayed to the tiny wooden picture booth on the outskirts of his land. The concept for the booth came from his wife, Sarah. Installed prior to her death last summer, intended to provide an entertaining method for tourists to preserve recollections of their wilderness adventures, it now stood by alone in the rising storm. A single reminder of Marcus had been about to experience happier days. Close up for the evening, when he initially saw the enormous prints in the snow, they shone right out of the thick woodland, in the direction of his lodge. But what caused his blood their size in 15 years was run cold. He had never seen bear tracks before. The tracks were so big that they told a strange tale. The bear had something that made his skin crawl. Went to his lodge, but after a while, for some reason, they had strayed from the main structure and proceeded through the thickening of the picture booth snowfall. Marcus was able to spot a huge black shape that was motionless in the snow next to where the bear's booth was. Its massive body had fallen slumber there, curled up against the exterior wall of the booth. This scene chilled him to the bone. This year, bears should be well into hibernation season, not sleeping outside in a snowfall, but this was drawn by something. One out of something strong enough to conquer its natural as darkness slithered across the Marcus, found the landscape to be more disturbing. Information. There were additional tracks in the smaller ones that are partially obscured by snow, but human footprints are still discernible, leading to the picture booth many hours prior to the bear's arrival. The footprints were those of the Anderson family visitors from Seattle, who had brought up snapping pictures that afternoon in the booth. Their cabin was situated on the property's far side, and he hadn't witnessed them bring the father back. As promised, Tom will bring their two Emma and Lucas. Two kids are hot. Chocolate in the lodge's main area. Upon there, they never showed up for the photo shoot. Outside, a howling wind rattled the lodge's windows, while Mara's eyes stayed still on the booth and the sleeping bear. The tiny light in the structure continued to glow. A solitary beacon. Dimly shining through the snow, something was visible amid the deepening darkness. The bear's enormous form was horribly incorrect. Had been in deep for hours without moving. Sleep next to the booth as though protecting it. Some awful secret. The questions hammered Marcus's brain as he sat down. His coffee cup, while shaking his hands, would need to venture outside. He would have to examine the expanding booth. A feeling of fear in his stomach informed him that he was aware of what he might discover, but he couldn't have been prepared for the fearing what lay next. Marcus tugged on his shaky fingers with a thick winter coat, took his rifle, and fastened the 20 years of using a flashlight to his chest. Experience in the woods had not prepared the familiar weight for him. At this moment of his firearm provided minimal solace as he went out into the harsh night in Alaska. The snow was now thicker and falling more forcefully. His beard was gathering flakes and obscuring his view as he moved closer to it was like going through a photo booth. Nightmare at a distance of 50 yards, he could more clearly see the bear's enormous proportions evidently. The creature had not moved. From its black bulk's weird slumber rising and sinking steadily and deeply breaths, new snow had piled up. Its fur is several inches deep, implying that it had been resting in the hours in the same spot. The sight made no bear would sleep because of Marcus' skin creep, so vulnerable in the middle, so exposed of a snowfall unless there was forced to remain in the beam of his flashlight, sliced through the swirling snow to expose information that caused his stomach to turn. The booth's surrounding ground was discolored by something black, its hue subdued by new powder, but blood is clearly visible. Long streaks rather than merely sporadic drops across the white terrain. Heading straight to the entrance of the booth, the crimson trails vanished behind the new snowfall. As though nature was attempting to conceal something awful as Marcus snuck, he examined the sleeping bear more closely with growing fear. It was the biggest grizzly that he had ever seen, shoulders wider than the hood of a truck. Its enormous paws might crush a man's skull with just one swipe. Yet look at it, slept well, but unnaturally next to the tiny wooden building that appears to be something was appointed by an enigmatic force. Protector of whatever tragedy was in store, the light inside the picture booth flickered, creating eerie, dancing shadows feebly across the shattered snowflakes of ripped cloth snagged on the exterior wall of the booth like surrender. They fluttered in the wind. Flag's Marcus almost passed out when he identified the vivid blue substance. The IT came from Emma Anderson's latest winter collection. Quote the person she was extremely proud of just that morning at breakfast. Show him his thoughts were filled with awful opportunities. Within 15 feet of the booth, Marcus could now hear the bear's booming breathing. The enormous head of the beast perched on its paws, just a few inches away from the rose, is steaming from booth's wall. Nostrils with every breath, producing tiny even as it sleeps. Ice crystals form in its fur, appeared incredibly strong and powerful. The rifle that Marcus was holding was lethal, felt as practical as a toothpick all of a sudden, against such unadulterated strength. The tracks told a tale that made him feel colder than the bear's huge prints was icy cold, indicated that it had gone around the booth numerous times before ultimately telling a lie, falling asleep. But the trend was oddly methodical, almost intentional. Hadn't clawed or attempted to break in at the walls or flung its mass against the door rather than just sunk as if standing in the snow. Guard or waiting? Yelled the inquiry. Marcus's thoughts, anticipating what the curtain hung stiffly, half open, with Marcus arrived at the ice-covered frost. For it with an intensely shaking hand just feed, knowing that the sleeping behemoth away one incorrect action, one loud noise in the bear may cause the cloth to wake up. As he started, it crackled like glass cracking. He used his flashlight beam to draw it away, shuddered as it pierced the night. Inside, and what he observed there convinced him, cover his lips with his hand to stifle a shriek that undoubtedly would have awakened the beast at his side. Marcus beamed using a flashlight. The scene showed thus terrible fear that his legs almost sagged beneath him. The cramped room inside the picture booth, which typically indicated to record happy events, had turned into the Anderson family's frozen grave, was squeezed within, their bodies twisted in positions that demonstrated their desperation. Tom Anderson sat glumly in the last moments. His skin was horribly pressed against the rear wall. A blue-white blood hue was frozen, and his right leg had extensive rivulets, forming red icicles that sparkled in the light from the flashlight. His eyes were open. However, blindness froze over like a frozen. He gripped his leg against his chest. Kids whose arms were stuck in place, a father's final effort to explain what his decaying body could only provide a small amount of warmth. Emma and Lucas were pressure for information, their diminutive forms against their father almost unidentifiable behind the layers of icy ice that enveloped them. Emma's lengthy red hair was brittle and frozen solid, strands covering her face as though Lucas's hand remains in a crystalline shroud, held his inhaler in his dark fingers. When frostbite first appears, their lips and skin had become deeply crimson. It was so pale that it was nearly transparent in the bright light. The interior of the booth revealed a tale of a last-ditch effort to survive that made Marcus's agony tore fragments of clothes had been packed in each splinter and fracture a futile endeavor to keep the deadly cold, empty candy out. A smashed water bottle and wrappers indicated that they have some supplies on hand when they took in Emma's cherished stuffed animal. The bear was abandoned in the corner, given up in their haste to prevent a cell phone with a hole in the wall, the broken screen was worthless under their final connection to salvation demolished. But it was the digital display that made the entire extent of following the catastrophe. The screen remains worked by cycling through the captured images. In the last few hours, the first revealed the family grinning, without knowing what would happen to them, then caught the moment in which everything through the window of the booth, the huge bear was observed coming. The pictures below showed their fear, a sequence of hazy images displaying chaos and fear as Tom reportedly attempted, in order to protect his kids. Something in the last images created Marcus's blood freeze, the bear following that first instead of trying to break in. The attacker had started to keep watch over the booth before eventually getting comfortable in the snow beyond the display's time-stamped images demonstrated the pattern's persistence. The beast had just rested for hours. There, dozing off in the icy cold, like though awaiting the inevitable hand of Marcus trembled when he extended his hand to look for a pulse. But he was positive that he was also lately. The flesh under his fingers was frozen solid as marble, but then incredibly, he sensed something that the little flutter under Tom's frozen skin, a faint throb that indicated that the tiniest glimmer of life persisted. He checked the kids hurriedly. The same miracle AUL was released from Emma's neck. Lucas was also so weak that he nearly missed it, held on to life by the slimmest of margins. Although they were still alive, they were far from their bodies, had become in a state of severe hypoxia, delaying their essential processes to almost nothing. The quite cold, which ought to have killed them, had managed to keep them intact, placing them as if in a frozen state. The knowledge of the bear's action struck Marcus with incredible force by its enormous, lying against the booth. The worst of the wind had been muffled by the body. Its size had produced a tiny area of relative warmth that is just sufficient to avoid the household from going totally cold. The predator had solidified into an unintentional protector, despite the fact that intentions were still unclear. Were they awaiting their demise, or having someone was driven by an incomprehensible instinct to protect through the lengthy, icy night? The outside, the sound of shifting snow created the bear was moving when Marcus's heart stopped. Its huge bulk adjusts when it sleeps. Placed the object against the booth wall. The wooden framework squealed as the Emma's body jerked under the pressure, evidence that a portion of her still consciousness persisted in that. Marcus realized in frozen form that he had only times to make the family appear to be living, but almost every second that he postponed decreased their odds of surviving, although the bear slept a few inches from us. Merely a tiny wooden barrier separating them all. One incorrect motion, one very loud noise in their guardian can turn into their executioner. The terror of the Anderson problem was now complete. Family had endured by way of a miracle of temperature and time, but there to be saved, one would have a thread, and Marcus would have to use an impossible needle. Figure out how to get 3 frozen corpses from this temporary grave without arousing the giant that was dozing outside, as though the bear, detecting his thoughts, released a breathing noise that muddled the booth's tiny window. The noise was a gloomy reminder that the kindness of nature could turn swift descent into barbarism. Marcus realized each moment was valuable, but one mistake move might make a rescue into a catastrophe. Made himself think systematically. In spite of the trauma he saw, that the survival of his family now rested on the capacity to maintain composure outside. The enormous figure of the bear resumed its deep steam from its nostrils as it sleeps first. He entered the frigid night air. Need to determine the scope of their injuries. Tom had a frozen wound on his leg, solid, which had really stopped him from the frostbite. Bleeding out on Lucas had severe fingers, although they weren't yet when Emma's bare arms revealed the deep tissue model patterns. If all three showed the symptoms of extreme hypothermia, their respiration is faint and their skin is waxy, so superficial that it was hardly seen the outside. The wind howled as Marcus he spread his bulky cloak over Emma, and the biting cold hit Lucas right away, via his woolen shirt. Although he was aware victims of hypothermia required additional warmth, he pulled an emergency radio after that from his belt, hardly raising the volume finally, over a whisper, "This is Marcus." He inhaled into the Frontier Lodge. Device code blue. 3 individuals suffered serious injuries. Hypothermia requires prompt medical attention. Place where I replicate the active bear scenario, the reply was hardly audible. The storm was interfering with the crackle. Transmission. But he managed to capture some regarding the dispatch of a helicopter. They must touch down at the lodge's helipad around a quarter of a mile away. He somehow needed to move 3 frozen corpses without awakening across heavy snow outside. The monster that is asleep is moving with glacial lag. Marcus started the Lucas's precise extraction process. The boy's body had initially frozen. His clothing were partially glued to the bench. Swiftly to the metal surface, with each motion generated microscopic crackling noises that made Marcus's eyes dart, and his heart stops the window through which the enormous head of the bear Lucas came loose while resting a few inches away. With a noise akin to tearing paper, he was seized by Marcus before he could fall, holding the boy's stiff body and the child's weighed nearly little while in his arms. Tiny corpse that is almost completely frozen through. Marcus could see through the window of the booth that the sound makes Bear's ear twitch, but the beast was still engrossed in its enigmatic. Emma's sleep was more challenging till she had tangled her frozen hair in the mechanical parts of the booth, and every broken strand sounded like a shot in the cramped area. When he eventually released her, he found that the angle at which the legs were frozen made difficult. She would be almost impossible to fit through the slender door while maintaining a level body as required by the appropriate hypothermia protocol. Tom the man's challenge was the worst. The bigger frame had turned into a protecting curl around his kids, and his wounded leg had frozen on the ground in one of his pools. Own blood. Every effort to release that grip feared making a noise that would undoubtedly arouse the bear. But abandoning him was. Marcus decided that it was not an option. That contradicted all medical education. Protocol that he was aware he would need to use his own to partially defrost Tom's leg. His naked hands being pressed by body heat, he felt his blood against the frozen one. The pain was from the skin sticking to the ice, burning instantly. But he held position, observing through the window as the bear kept sleeping soundly. Minutes flew by like hours as they were inches away. Marcus put out every effort to get Tom free, removing ice from each cloth scrape spiked on the walls of the booth. He felt the bear's breathing with terror, stayed stable and deep, yet it's enormous. Occasionally, the paws twitched, indicating Marcus wished it wasn't a dream. Finally, having a food-related dream after what felt like an eternity, he had succeeded in place each of the 3 victims close to the now. Booth's arrival was the most they would have to leave the hazardous area. The booth, while traversing the heavy snow, without stepping over the sleeping bear's sound. The crust of the snow had solidified, and every step would be risky due to the harsh cold, making a loud cracking sound. But the storm had grown more intense, which was both blessing and curse. The wind that howls might aid mass in making some noises, but it also indicated that the helicopter would face a more difficult. The temperature had decreased at the time of landing, deeper more, and Marcus sensed his own body beginning to tremble wildly from revealing his nude. His fingers were numb, and his arms were beginning to take on a concerning tint of white. With unending caution, he started to drag Lucas through the drapes. The sound of frozen, rigid fabric was similar to the bear's ear twitched as the glass broke. Once more, and its enormous head raised a little before calming down again. Marcus felt his heart racing so hard that I was afraid the beast might hear. But there was no going back now. Anderson, the sole hope for the family's survival, was three frozen bodies. He could move without awakening them. Across the snow in the distance, the Guardian is barely sleeping. Over the storm, he could hear that the first barely audible helicopter blade Hondo assistance was on the way. He still needed to get them all to safety, as though they could sense the as assistance arrived. The bear moved in its massive body pressing, while its sleeps more resilient to the outer wall of the booth. The whole building moaned beneath the pressure. Marcus peered down at he held his frozen family in his arms back then, eyeing the dormant giant that had turned into both their potential and guardian. The true horror, executioner, wasn't simply what he discovered within the booth, was aware that either their redemption or their doom, everything depended on whether the bear carried on with its unexplained slumber. In the distance to the lodge was covered in snow. Marcus moved in a way that never appeared so large. Through the heavy snow and excruciating pain slowly, his body shook from the cold and fatigue he had succeeded in obtaining in his coat. Lucas and Emma are making an improvised sled to help them go to the Tom's frozen form, which he partially carried, attempting to keep the damaged half dragged, catching on the crusty snow with the leg's surface every couple of steps, and he looked back, where the bear is in the picture booth, remaining in its enigmatic sleep, that the dark mass of the thing was hardening to see through the storm's growing intensity. However, its existence burdened him like the physical sound of the helicopter became louder, and Marcus prayed in silence. The asleep would not be awakened by the sounds. The wind sliced through his thin, giant knife-like shirt, and his bare skin had transformed from a painful to frozen family is behind the numbing. He was in much worse shape than severe cold that had kept they could yet be claimed by lives if he failed to get assistance in time at every stage. Had to be placed carefully to avoid the crust of the snow from shattering with a halfway to the lodge. Crack is telling Lucas's body jolted abruptly, with a shivering violently, was both alarming and an optimistic that the youngster was displaying indications of life, but the motion made him freeze. Clothing to rub up against the snow's cold surface, the noise seemed to reverberate in the Marcus froze, his gaze locked in the winter air. The bears in the far-off photo booth, enormous head raised, and for one heart-stopping notion that he would ascend, but after an apparently interminable it paused and returned to its snow bed, still engrossed in whatever bizarre dreams kept it there, because the helicopter was nearby. Now, the searchlight is penetrating as the snow swirled. Marcus could see his lodge's windows that are brightly lit up ahead, promising haven. However, the sound of the noise of the aircraft increased, deafening out even the tremors traveled across the roaring wind, through the icy terrain, and Marcus horrified as the bear eventually started to move with the remainder of using his strength. He raised Tom's frozen body, and the snow's crust cracked as it was pushed forward. Underneath his feet, with incisive reports, such as there were gunshots behind him, of a huge object shaking off snow, then a profound rumble that he experienced within his bones. The front of the lodge was being awakened by the bear. Warm light poured out as the door exploded. Rescuers poured across the snow, out approaching him in emergency blankets and medical supplies. That shouts felt unnaturally loud following the lengthy silence. During his attempt to save, Marcus tripped over the last few steps and felt the frozen family is taken by powerful hands. From only then did he gaze back at him. Through the snow-covered drape, he witnessed the bear grow to its maximum height. In addition to the photo booth, its enormous size was outlined against the steam of the storm. Emerging into the cold air from its fur for a considerable amount of time, it stood entirely still, as though reflecting on the scene before it. And then it turned silently and vanished as they padded into the woodland, into the white darkness that swirled as enigmatic as it had been for hours. Marcus later waited in the hospital. His own hands were wrapped in the room from the doctors had referred to frostbite, as if the Anderson family's survival was a miracle. Their body temperature sufficiently enough to maintain brain function. Without going too low, Tom's leg would have to be lethal in order for major surgery. But he would keep it the kids because of their dad's protection, and the peculiar situation of their experience would make complete heals. But Marcus was plagued by questions of what prevented the bear from entering the booth. Why had it been forced to sleep in the snow next to it over the lengthy frozen night? The professionals who arrived to investigation yielded no answers, for the bear's footprints revealed a tale that defied it had not been normal behavior. Those hibernating had not been ill or hurt. It had just decided to remain and sleep there. The lethal chill, as though on watch over the family confined within the picture no answers, were found on the booth memory card. Only pictures that Marcus would remember eternity. The last picture taken just prior to save them. Jesus displayed to the massive body of the bear pressed up against the breath icing on the window of the booth glass. In its eyes' faint reflection appeared quite human, brimming with an intelligence that was inexplicable upon the Anderson family's recovery sufficient to recount their tale. They lacked belief that they had been protected by their final recollections of the night were of the Tom's first assault while fighting to shield his kids from seeking safety in their sole chance of surviving in the booth. They were sleeping in a hypothermic state, thinking the bear intended to murder them, unaware that it had turned into their improbable savior. The booth remains intact. However, near the boundary of Marcus property, travelers now rely on bitter winter evenings with heavy snowfall and quiet. He occasionally stands at his window and observes it, and occasionally in the deep blackness of winter in Alaska, he claims to have seen a huge circle, the tiny building before laying down to rest under the snow, protecting the secrets that nature was never intended to be shared.